The days stretched into weeks, the rhythm of life on the ranch altered by the presence of strangers who no longer felt so strange. Thomas McGraw mended slowly, his steps still stiff with pain, but steadying. He rose with the dawn to split kindling or draw water, gestures that spoke of gratitude more than his words ever did. His silence had a weight to it, but not the emptiness of Eleanor's own. His was the silence of a man holding back, as if the past clung too close to speak aloud. Clara wove herself into the fabric of Eleanor's days with effortless grace. At breakfast, she sat swinging her legs at the table, eager for chores, eager for stories. She asked Eleanor what her husband had been like, if he had like horses, if he had been kind. The questions tore and healed in the same breath, yet Eleanor answered softly, as though her words stitched the girl into the home she had once thought hollow. On quiet evenings, she brushed Clara's hair by the fire, each stroke of the comb untangling not only the child's curls, but something in Eleanor's own chest that had been knotted too long. But beyond the fences, the town's whispers only thickened. Each trip Eleanor made to the mercantile carried the sting of Abigail Sutton's eyes boring into her. The matron's voice, sweetened with false pity, always seemed to carry. A widow must think of her reputation. Folks are talking. The other women nodded, and the men glanced away, unwilling to be caught staring too long at scandal. Eleanor felt the weight of it most at church. She walked with Thomas and Clara beside her, their presence a shield and a burden. The pews seemed narrower, the hymn slower, the preacher's sermon on charity and judgment laced with pointed echoes. Eleanor kept her chin lifted, though she could feel the heat rising at her collar. When the service ended, no hands reached for hers, no smiles offered welcome. Instead, only Clara's small palm slipped into her own, grounding her with the innocence of trust. By then, Sheriff Dalton had returned more than once, circling Thomas like a wolf sniffing for weakness. "Stranger in town," he'd muttered, "never sits right with folks unless they know his business." His questions grew sharper. Where had Thomas come from? Who was after him? Why had he turned up half dead on a widow's land? Thomas answered with deflection, his jaw set, his eyes cold steel. Eleanor knew there was more, something coiled in his silence. The truth unraveled one evening in the barn, lanterns swinging shadows against the rafters. Eleanor had gone out to fetch kindling, and stopped at the sound of Dalton's voice. "You can't keep hiding, McGraw. Not with a child in tow." Thomas's reply was low, gravel worn smooth by resolve. "I wasn't hiding. I was surviving." Then came the words that struck Eleanor like a hammer on glass. "I am Thomas McGraw, newly appointed mayor of this town. They tried to kill me on the road. Left me for dead so another man could claim the seat. My only concern was keeping Clara safe." The sheriff cursed under his breath, half in disbelief, half in reluctant respect. Eleanor's lantern trembled in her hand as she stepped into view. The weight of the revelation pressed on her chest. This man she had pitied, had nursed, had defended to the whispers of the town, was no helpless drifter. He carried both power and danger. For a long moment Thomas met her eyes, and in them she saw no pride, only weariness. "I wasn't ready to trust anyone," he said quietly. "But you gave us shelter without knowing who I was." His words were not grand, but they lodged deep within her. By morning, there was no containing the truth. Word spread like fire through dry grass. The stranger in Widow Whitfield's home was no ordinary cowboy. He was the town's mayor. Some spoke with awe, others with scorn. Abigail Sutton was the loudest of them all, her tongue sharper than ever. She knew she must have known. A widow doesn't take in a man like that without ambition. The townsfolk gathered at the square, a swell of judgment pressing Eleanor into their circle. Sheriff Dalton tried to temper them, but voices rose, demanding answers. Eleanor, though her knees quivered beneath her skirts, stood before them. The air was thick, the smell of dust and sweat sharp in her lungs. Her voice, when it came, was not loud but steady, each word weighted with truth. "I did what any soul ought to. I saw a wounded man and a frightened child, and I chose compassion over cruelty. If that makes me guilty in your eyes, then so be it." Silence swept over the crowd, broken only by the creak of a sign in the wind. Then Thomas stepped forward, his presence commanding even in plain clothes. He drew himself up, the quiet dignity of a man who had nearly been buried, now shining like steel burnished in flame. "This woman saved my life," he said, his voice carrying across the hush. "Not for my title, not for what I could offer. She acted where many of you would have turned away. And if I am to serve as your mayor, it is her courage I will look to as example." The tension broke, pride and shame mingling on the faces of the crowd. Eyes dropped, heads bowed. Abigail Sutton's lips thinned, her words withering on her tongue. For the first time in years, Eleanor felt the weight of judgment lift, replaced by a quiet respect that needed no applause. The moment held like the stillness after a storm. Thomas turned, his eyes searching hers, and though no declaration passed his lips, he reached for her hand. The gesture was simple, unadorned, yet it carried the weight of promise, of gratitude, of something that might one day grow into love. Clara, smiling through the hush, pressed herself against Eleanor's skirt, as if she already knew they had become family. The crowd dispersed slowly, whispers now tinged with awe rather than scorn. Eleanor stood in the square with Thomas at her side, Clara's hand in hers, the sun cutting gold through the clouds above. For the first time since widowhood had hollowed her, she did not feel alone. And in the soft voice of memory, the story closed upon itself. Sometimes, a stranger does not arrive to shatter your solitude, but to remind you it was never meant to last. In the eyes of a child, in the hand of a wounded man, Eleanor Whitfield found the beginning of her second life. So if you, too, have ever been judged for opening your door to another, remember this. The heart is wiser than the world's whispers, and compassion is the only legacy the wind will not carry away. But deep down, she knew the answer had already taken root. Under a moon that silvered the wheat stubble and whispered through the eaves of her roof, Eleanor Whitfield moved about her lonely ranch like a ghost tending the remains of a vanished life. The night air was cold, crisp enough to bite, but it was the silence that weighed most on her. Some nights, she swore, she could still hear her husband's boots strike the floorboards, hear the low rumble of his laugh in the barn. But the wind only carried emptiness. She pulled her shawl tighter, knowing grief had long since settled into her bones like winter frost. The storm had rolled in sudden, hurling rain against the windows, rattling the shutters. Eleanor was stacking wood by the hearth when she heard it, the faintest sound out in the barn. Not the creak of wood nor the shifting of hay. A rustle. A presence. Her first thought was foxes or worse, drifters. Lantern in hand, she crossed the muddy yard, her pulse a quickened drum beneath her shawl. When she pushed open the barn door, the lantern's glow fell upon a sight that rooted her in place. A man lay slumped against a hay bale, hat tilted, shirt soaked in blood dark as tar. Beside him knelt a girl, no older than 8, her small hands gripping his larger one with desperate strength. Her eyes, wide and glass-bright in the dim, fixed on Eleanor. They held no words, only pleading. Eleanor's fear flared, then faltered. There, beneath the storm's roar, something in her heart gave way. She should have turned them out. That's what the town would say. A lone widow harboring a stranger? Foolishness, if not outright scandal. But she saw the wound at the man's side, saw the child clutching him like a tether, and her resolve melted like wax. Setting down the lantern, she stooped, voice soft as though soothing a skittish colt. "Come now, child. Let's get him inside." The man stirred, lips parted, but no words followed. His eyes, shadowed with pain, flicked up at her, then fell shut again. Between them, she and the girl managed to lift him across the yard, staggering beneath his weight until they reached the small warmth of her kitchen. The storm pressed its fists against the windows, while Eleanor fetched water, cloth, her hands trembling as she pressed them to his bleeding side. The girl hovered near, as though she would crumble if she let go of him. Eleanor had not tended a man's body in years, not since death had carried her husband away. The intimacy of it, the heat of his skin under her hands, the low groan from his chest, unsettled her. Still, she worked, washing blood from his side, the lantern flickering gold across their faces. She thought of what the town would say if they saw her now. A widow alone, bent over an unconscious man in her kitchen. The thought burned her cheeks, but she did not stop. By morning, word had already begun its crawl. Abigail Sutton's sharp tongue carried it first through the mercantile, then into the church pews. Widow Whitfield had taken in a stranger, and not just any stranger, one wounded, no doubt a drifter with a story too dark to tell. Sheriff Dalton Price himself rode up by midday, his face carved into suspicion as he dismounted in her yard. Inside, Eleanor stood tall though her hands shook. He was bleeding, she told the sheriff, voice even, and the child had no one. Dalton's gaze shifted to the man, still pale on her bed, Then to Clara, the girl, who watched him with wide, unblinking eyes. "Be careful who you take in," Dalton warned, his tone neither kind nor cruel, only heavy with implication. Eleanor held her chin high, though shame prickled her skin like nettles. The man, his name, she learned, was Thomas McGraw, spoke little in those first days. His words came in gravel tones, brief thanks and quiet nods. Yet his silence carried weight, a kind of dignity Eleanor had not expected. She watched the way he shielded Clara from the cold drafts, the way his hand steadied her back when she stumbled. Strength, even in weakness. Clara, in her soft way, began to stitch herself into Eleanor's days. Together they fed the chickens, the child's laughter light, as wind chimes in the stillness of the yard. She asked questions with the innocence of one who had not yet learned how cruel the world could be. Eleanor felt her heart tug with every small smile, every trusting glance. She had not thought herself capable of mothering again, yet the ache of it grew sweet rather than sharp. Still, the whispers clung. In town, eyes lingered too long on Eleanor's back, mouths bent in half-hidden smirks. "The widow's grown reckless," Abigail said loud enough for her to hear. Eleanor pretended not to notice, but the words stung all the same. She had spent years living within walls of propriety, enduring loneliness rather than risk judgment. Now, for the first time, she questioned whether kindness was worth the cost. That night, after Clara had dozed by the fire and Thomas had fallen into restless sleep, Eleanor sat alone, watching them breathe. The lantern's flame carved shadows on the walls, and in that fragile light she whispered to herself, barely a breath, "What am I doing? Opening doors I swore shut." But deep down, she knew the answer had already taken root.